It's a great pleasure for me to be asked to be involved in this event. Delighted to meet new friends such as Michael Schellenberger and Andrew Doyle and Stephanie, who just told me that she's a big fan. I have made a lot of friends through this movement. I was telling them earlier on, I had my hair cut there not too long ago. I think it was Holy Thursday. And as I was exiting from the barber shop, I was summoned by this lady who had just arrived, and she was planning to have a much longer session at the hairdressers than I just had. And she said, "Are you a politician?" And I just summoned up my courage and I said, "Yes, am I in trouble?" She said, No, I very much liked what you did in the recent referendums. I was a no voter as well. And she said, "And I have to say, I wasn't always bedfellows with you." And I was very tempted to say, well, now that we are in bed together, maybe we could have some pillow talk about some of those issues that previously divided us. But my courage failed me. Like the professor there, I'm not naturally courageous. You know, I'd be like a friend of mine who describes himself as a pacifist by physique. So I just left the barber shop and took the compliment and hoped she was an NUI graduate and might do the decent thing at the next election. But undoubtedly, the cause of free speech and defending the free speech is something that unites people who would describe themselves as liberal or conservative, if those phrases mean anything anymore. Because essentially, we can't have a free society unless we get to test each other's ideas. And what I found, if you like, most repulsive about the government's hate speech legislation still do, and we have to be, my big message to anyone that wants to listen to me tonight is lobby your politicians to keep doing it, and when you've finished doing it, lobby them again. Because unless you use your pester power online and in person in the nicest possible way and make their lives a misery, then they're going to pretend to amend this legislation but not really amend it in the serious way that it needs to be amended. So that's, the big thing for me this evening. But the problems as I see it with that, as say, hate speech legislation, it's just far too vague. I'm not a free speech absolutist. I have to confess I may get booed here. I'm preparing legislation on age verification around child protection and access to pornography, so I'm not going to pretend I'm an absolute, completely libertarian person when it comes to freedom of expression. Maybe nobody or none of you here would ever suspect me of being that anyway. But when it comes to democracy, I believe in it. And when it becomes to the right to test each other's ideas, I believe in it. And we can't do that if we're operating under the chilling or the fear of giving offence to somebody who wraps that up as hatred, claims it's against the law, and attacks you as a mob online and causes social media companies, and you're absolutely right, there's absolutely no accident that all this is happening in Ireland. It basically gets social media companies to take down your stuff, so you have failed to communicate before you've even begun to try. And it's that chilling effect. It's the fact that the very process, if nobody was ever prosecuted under this legislation, the process itself is the punishment. If you have to think about whether you're going to have a knock at the door from the Gardaí, and I'm the type of person that when I see that blue light going on behind me because I've committed yet another traffic offence, I get the lurch in my stomach, and I suspect there's a lot of people like me. And as a politician that's, brought up to speak my mind, but also has something of a big mouth and a brass neck, it's not people like me that the free speech, that this hate speech legislation targets. It's people who maybe haven't been trained up in the art of advocacy to any extent, who may be sometimes a bit clumsy in the way they want to express their disquiet or concern about things. And if you're a parent that absolutely abhors the fact, for example, that there's a trans activist coming into your school without you being consulted, spewing stuff that is, to say the least, contested, not to say completely false, at your children at a formative stage of their life, and you want to let rip in no uncertain terms in the media and maybe a bit impolite about it, well, unless you're threatening violence against that person, you should be allowed to say what you want to say. And that is the way ordinary people go about things. That's it. With an applause like that, I'd be tempted to follow Ming Flanagan's example and say, maybe, what about a run for the presidency? No, I won't go there. Okay. So without further ado, I want to introduce two people who I admire greatly. Lorcán Price from Alliance Defending Freedom. Would this be a good time, Lorcán, to give a shout out to our friends in the Southern Poverty Law Centre? Maybe not. But Lorcán Price of ADF International, a wonderful advocate, a great debater, a very clear thinker, is going to speak. And also my friend and colleague, Sharon Keogan from the Shannon, who has been a very strong voice on many important issues, free speech not the least of them. And with about 5 minutes to go, I'm going to call up my friend to put the questions, or to the questions that have been carefully curated, screening out all the libelous ones, to run that Q&A from the floor with about 5 minutes to go to the end of the session. I had two questions in my mind, really, that I wanted to start with, and I have a feeling it'll just run from there without difficulty. I'm going to start by asking Lorcán, because he has, in addition to being very well versed in the politics of Ireland, he also has a great portfolio of, a base of knowledge across many jurisdictions. And I would like him to address in a moment the question of why, as you see it, not just from an Irish perspective, but from an international perspective, is this hate speech legislation so bad and problematic? Sharon, I want to give you then, I'll come to you second maybe, to talk about where you see the big problems of the legislation as being. But no politician ever gets away with telling a colleague what to say. You'll say whatever you want to say. That's what free speech is all about. Okay, Lorcán, though, will you get us started and give us the best of your local and international expertise on this issue?
All right, thank you, Rónán. Before I begin, I was struck by Michael's remarks about narcissism, grandiosity and self-entitlement. But it's hard to remain humble when your face is plastered at the very centre of the poster behind. I'll do my best, though. I like to consider myself very humble, the most humble, in fact. I'm extremely humble. So your question is well put, Rónán, because what we're seeing in this jurisdiction is a trend across Western Europe and the Western world, really, of censorship in the name of defending in many cases, minorities from hate. And there's a lot to unpack in what that constitutes. But a view set in certain academic circles, certainly in the 1980s, that the concept that words are wounding, that you can, in terms of power dynamics between groups in society, that particularly somebody like myself, straight white man, has all the power. And so therefore me using a right, and it is a human right, as Professor O'Dell said at the outset, of freedom of expression, is simply to cement my own power and to take power from other groups in society. And so this is a contested political view, but it gradually made its way, sadly, into the law. And while you certainly see elements of the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights where there can be criminalisation of certain speech, even in the freedom of expression provisions, that, in many ways, was pushed by the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact bloc at the time. So certainly the genesis of all those ideas is from there. But increasingly in the West, even though Western nations opposed those provisions at the time, and we pointed to things like Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights protecting freedom of expression, we have adopted, sadly, this creeping censorship in the name of preventing hate. And from the kind of position of litigating these cases in Strasbourg over the years at the ECHR, I was able to see this across Europe. And Ireland is not immune to that, alas. We've had an Incitement to Hatred Act in this country, the 1989 Act. But in the last 20 years, I was looking at the figures recently, there's only been 44, or rather from 2000 to 2020, there'd been 44 convictions. Now that was at a time when Ireland underwent extraordinary demographic and social change. And yet, even with the tools the state had at the time, there were very few prosecutions for hate. And I think that goes very much to your point, Michael, which is that there's no explosion of hate in this society. Irish people are very fair-minded, and they want to be able to discuss things openly. And the fact that we never prosecuted these things in a way, I think, goes some way to raising a serious question about the need for it now. But where these laws are introduced, I'm thinking of a case that I've been involved in now for over 5 years, that of Päivi Räsänen, who's a member of the Finnish Parliament. She was the Interior Minister of Finland and was prosecuted under their criminal code for inciting hatred against gay people for tweeting that the Finnish Lutheran Church should not use church money to sponsor the Helsinki Pride Parade, something, in fact, that they were doing. She tweeted a verse from the Bible, and so it became known as the Bible trial in Finland, and it's now going to the Supreme Court of Finland. And this is a warning to the politicians on the panel. She, in fact, voted for the very law that was then subsequently used to prosecute her. And I don't think either of the two politicians here will have that problem, not the prosecution side, but the voting for it. And And she felt at the time, quite fair-mindedly, that she wanted to ensure that the amount of hatred in society was dealt with, and that we use the law as where educationally to try and stop the targeting of minority groups. But she never thought that it would be used against her. And it wasn't just a tweet. They then went back and found a document, a pamphlet that she'd written nearly 20 years ago on the Christian conception of marriage, and they added that to the charge as well. She was indicted for writing that. So she was looking at up to 2 years in prison and a very significant fine for something she'd written 20 years ago and for something that she tweeted. And so it's not just in Finland, but there are other cases as well. There's a cases of a bishop in Spain who was under criminal investigation for having as well expressed his views robustly about Pride Month. And we've had many cases in the United Kingdom as well, prosecuted under a range of legislation there. And I see Andrew Doyle in the audience, who's drawn a lot of attention to this in his work. So this trend across the West is deeply concerning. And it's arrived finally at our own doorstep here in Ireland. And there are many aspects, I won't go into the legislation in great detail, but there are many aspects that are very significantly concerning. One is the circular definition of hate. And it's, as Professor O'Dell will undoubtedly be lecturing his students, one of critical importance in the criminal law. Constitutionally, the Supreme Court have held this, that the law needs to be precise so that people can govern their conduct and they can understand whether or not they've committed an offence. But how is that possible where the very heart of this legislation, you have a definition that relies on its own terms to define itself? We cannot know how to conduct ourselves if a hate offence is something that causes hate. You're no further to understanding whether or not your comment, in fact, would fall foul of the law. And not only that, there's significant problems as well in terms of the possession offences, the reversing of the burden of proof in relation to whether or not you intend to distribute the material, and I think as well the extraordinary powers of search and seizure that offend, as far as I'm concerned, against the right to silence and the right against self-incrimination. But make no mistake, they intend to use this law if they pass it. And Simon Harris, then acting as Minister for Justice, now the Taoiseach, was offered an amendment that would seek to define hate in line with some of the principles in a UN document called the Rabat Plan of Action on Hate Speech. He rejected the amendment. It was actually offered by People Before Profit, so it came from his left. He rejected it because, and I'm paraphrasing here, it would make it more difficult to secure convictions under the legislation. So they're very clear about the intention of this. And I think the real, Rónán touched or alluded to it in his remarks, the real thing is to create a chilling effect. If you want to express your views on trans activism or migration, or climate change, or anything controversial, when you risk being criminalised for doing so, and you're not quite sure when you cross the line into a criminal offence, most people will say, actually, no, I won't go there. I'll remain silent. They don't have a lawyer on call. And that's precisely the problem. And that injures democracy. That truncates it. It leaves it in a situation where we're not able to speak about the problems of the day, where we're not able to have a respectful, open discussion for fear of being criminalised. And I think, Rónán, when you and your colleagues come to amend it, and I hope it is withdrawn, that very significant emphasis has to be placed on that definitional problem and some of the other elements of the offences.
Thank you, Laura.
I'm very privileged to walk in here this afternoon or this evening with many academics, but this law is not for academics. This law is going to have a chilling effect on the ordinary man and woman here in Ireland. Those who may not have the same ideas or those who may not be in favour of the government of the day. And that is the problem with this hate speech legislation. I fear what's going to happen. I fear it's all right for the likes of Rónán and I at this moment in time where we have parliamentary privilege. But outside of that, if we were to tweet something outside of Parliament, we're not protected. So we too could end up in trouble one day for what we tweet or what we say in Parliament. But for the ordinary, it's for the ordinary person, the person that might not be educated, that might speak up against immigration in this country. They may not have the same views as the Minister for Justice in relation to the numbers that we bring into this country, or they may have different ideas in relation to surrogacy in this country, or on abortion, or anything that the government are trying to push through, whatever the progressive idea of the day is. We are in serious trouble if we're not allowed to have that alternative view and alternative narrative being out there in the public. So what happens if somebody breaks the law? You get a knock on the door. The Gardaí arrive. They search your house. Not only will they seize every device that you have in your house, they'll seize all of your children's devices. They will look at your reading material. They will check everything out. They will ask you for passwords. If you fail to give the password, they will fine you, I think it's 5,000 or a year in jail. So this is a very, very serious piece of legislation. I'm happy to be working alongside Rónán on this and Senator McDowell. But outside of that, we have very few voices in the Seanad that are fighting this. And we very much rely on the public to basically support us in the work that we're doing. It is funny that, you know, when election, there's nothing that makes a politician more eager to come on to the right side than an election that's coming up. And some of the people that would have voted for the legislation last year in the Dáil have now come out and said, oh, we really didn't give it enough time. We didn't know what we were voting for. And now that I know, I'm against it. But it's already passed. It's already passed in the Dáil. So now the only hope for it is in the Seanad. They're saying they're going to bring it back again into the Dáil, but they won't. They absolutely won't. So we are up against, it is an uphill battle for us in the Seanad, but it's one that I firmly believe that is worth fighting. We were very lucky that the recent referendum, that there was a number of us on that side, and it was successful, and the people of Ireland seen what this government were trying to do by eroding the words mother, eroding the words woman in our constitution. And there was a fight back there by the Irish people. And I certainly hope when it comes to this legislation that you will continue to fight, because it is the public that will turn this around. It might be us when it comes to the amendments, but really it is you and the power that you have. And believe me, you have massive power. The public have massive power when it comes to this piece of legislation. That's why they haven't been so keen to push it forward, because of the public backlash. So you need to keep it up. You need to keep it up. You need to keep contacting your TDs and your senators. Make life, you know, as difficult as you can without being too aggressive, so you can go and make appointments with them. Go to their clinics. Tell them, ask them not to support the legislation when it comes to the Seanad. Tell them that you will not support them if they do run for general election. So these are the things that you can do. But I'm very happy to be working alongside Rónán and Michael McDowell, and the support that we've had in relation to Free Speech Ireland, it has been fantastic. They've been a fantastic voice out there to try and engage the public, because I think it's all about, it really is now about the public and getting the public behind this piece of legislation so it doesn't pass, so they actually bin it. We want them to bin this legislation. That's where we want them to go with it. Most of us, some of us have quite conservative views in relation to whether it be abortion or whether it be, you know, our faith. And there's nothing wrong to be able to speak about that every now and again. I don't want ever to be afraid to say that I'm a Catholic or I have Christian views. I never want to be able to have to shy away or not be proud of who I am as an individual. I'm proud of being a woman. I'm proud of being a mother. I'm proud of all of these things, and I don't see why I should not be able to say those things just because somebody else that might be a man doesn't feel the things that I feel when I say I am a mother, and they'll never get to experience what being a mother really is like. So I want to be able to continue the work that I do. I want to be able to speak as freely as I do in the Seanad, as long as I can. I thank you for your support, continued support, in all the emails that I get and all the cards that I get. I get plenty of emails, plenty of cards, and I really appreciate the support that I do get. Thank you.
I hereby cede my place on the presidential ballot, Sharon. Just a couple of quick points before we go to questions. One of the, as Lorcán said, the circularity of the definition of hatred, for me, would be front and centre of the problems. The second thing, with all of these new sets of protected characteristics, it's impossible to ignore the radical new definition of gender, because that takes us right into cancel culture territory. It's exactly in that area where if you dare say something that somebody doesn't like around things that people always took for granted about the difference between male and female and so on, that you will be accused of being a hater. Remember, the word hater is already out there as a slur to be used against people whose ideas you don't like. So when hate then is defined so vaguely as a crime, it's very easy to see the danger, how people will gang up and say this person is now committing an offence. Where are the Gardaí? You know, or indeed, as I say, getting social media and digital platforms to take down your stuff before it has a chance to be expressed at all. So that's, to me, the definition of hatred has to change, has to be made much more precise. We are talking about criminal law here, the extreme end of social sanction. And therefore, when you're talking about the extreme end of social sanction, you've got to be very precise about what the rules are, about what can or cannot be said. And we all know there are things that can't be said, like fire in the theatre and all of that. None of these rights are absolute, but there has to be clarity so that people know exactly where they stand. I think Simon Harris, of course, was standing in at the time for the Minister for Justice, Helen McEntee, did indeed let the cat out of the bag when he said this is about getting more prosecutions. If we don't, if we define hatred, we reduce our ability to prosecute it. I think it was also he who let the cat out of the bag by saying what we're trying to do here is to future-proof the legislation. So to be able to cover things in the future, that's not where you want, realities that we haven't yet had to deal with. That's not where you want the criminal law to be in terms of censoring people. The government, in its defence, will say, oh, but there's a defence of freedom of expression in the bill. There are certain defences of, literary and artistic and political and religious contributions to discourse. They are far too weak with the vagueness around hatred. Those defences don't count for anything, in my view. So it's time to lobby them. And, I would say as well that the perfect storm in Ireland happens. I say this, I suppose, as somebody to be described as a social conservative. When politicians will always pander to lobby groups, to sources of influence, maybe it's just human nature I'm describing, and whether those sources of influence are international or EU, it doesn't really matter, or as I said, influential lobby groups. When the media then fails to do its job and scrutinise, that's when you have bad legislation being pushed through like an express train. And we're seeing that on other issues in these days, in my view. For example, I don't know what your views on international surrogacy are, but let's agree that it's highly controversial. And yet legislation has been driven through like a dose of salt, as my late father would say, without proper discussion, because the media have been largely compliant around this issue, presenting people with human interest stories. That gives politicians an excuse. So what happened with the hate speech legislation was that enough of a storm was created about it in the Seanad and online. The mainstream media eventually realised, actually, these people have a point. You had prominent people like Graham Linehan and just a variety of different voices, Michael McDowell and yourself, the Seanad, and so on. Strange bedfellows, some would say, some of the time. But that was enough. And of course, the fact that an election was proximate, and the fact that you had people on the government side in the Seanad say, actually, maybe we need to look at this again. So the danger would be now that the election is out of the way, but the government are still, still comprised of the Green Party, who are among the drivers of this, that they would basically try and get it over the line with, pretend amendment, but amendment that isn't sufficiently substantial to undo the harm. And that's why citizens online and in person need to be very, very active to keep the pressure on the government parties in particular. We don't like this. You said you would reform it. It has to be seriously reformed. Nothing wrong with hate offences per se. Absolutely nothing wrong with prohibiting incitement to violence. That's already there, of course, in the legislation. It's around the vagueness of incitement to hatred that the problem is. And remember, the 1989 legislation, we were told that that wasn't adequate to cover the social media age. And yet when I saw the Electoral Commission's document ahead of the elections advising politicians on how they could keep themselves safe online in the context of the elections, among the pieces of legislation that were cited as there to support and keep law and order around areas of communication was the Prohibition of Incitement to Hatred Act of 1989. So it clearly still has effect and could be amended, except that that legislation has a more difficult threshold to meet because it says you have to be intending or likely to stir up hatred. And it's very interesting that Helen McEntee was saying, nothing to see here. This legislation we're introducing is all about preventing people from stirring up, except that that isn't in the new legislation. She was quoting the old legislation, which was more precise, in order to get a free pass for the new legislation, which is horribly and dangerously vague. So anyway, you've heard enough from me. You already know the issues very well. It's time to be active, but it's also time to answer questions. 4 minutes, 37 seconds. I've missed my deadline by 23 seconds. Up you get and take the questions from the floor.
For such a fascinating discussion. Now we've got time for questions from the audience. So the first one's going to be, I think you already touched on this, but just wanted to ask another question about the role of the media and the sort of attitude towards free speech we see in Ireland. To what extent do you think that the state media, particularly RTE, is ideologically captured on this question of free speech and the other media and so forth? And do you see any signs of hope in regards to the media when it comes to this question of free speech?
Well, very briefly, I see some signs of hope in that they cottoned on in recent times. You heard I started to hear the points that I and others were making being put to the government side, by people like Sarah McInerney on primetime. They came late to the party. Lorcán, Sharon, what's your perspective?
Sarah McInerney was excellent there, and was it the late debate or something? I'm not too sure, but she was absolutely excellent. She got Helen McEntee. She couldn't define the word hate, and I think that really the Irish people woke up. I think that's really what got the Irish people to woke up. Helen McEntee, the Minister for Justice in this country, could not define the word hate on national TV, and the game was up.
We need to get some Irish people to woke down as well. I think we'd all agree, wouldn't we? But anyway, would you?
Lorcán?
No, I completely agree with that. One thing that's Michael is certainly looking at in his work in this legislation, I think that's true of the censorship in the West generally, is the extent to which the legacy media, the establishment media, is terrified at losing its grip on the narrative. The fact that Elon Musk bought Twitter, X, is extraordinarily important because it has allowed, albeit not perfectly, free speech to flourish. And that is why I think in a lot of ways the legacy media either tacitly or implicitly supports this legislation and wants to see more regulations from the media commissioner here, Commissioner Namyan, on misinformation and disinformation. So in addition to the very easy grilling, not really a grilling at all, that Irish politicians get from RTE, I think generally, and this is my own opinion, the view in RTE would be they support this kind of thing and they want to see more of it.
The next question is going to be about the origins of this proposed legislation, the Irish Hate Speech Bill. So Michael's spoken a lot about the sort of censorship industrial complex and the way in which these NGOs sort of play a role in helping sort of lay the groundwork for this sort of legislation. To what extent do you think this legislation came originally from the Irish Parliament itself? And to what extent do you think that NGOs might have played a role in this?
Oh, you're directing that at me. Well, and I think ostensibly it comes from a requirement under the 2008 Framework Directive on Combating Racism and Xenophobia, which is a piece of EU. It was a framework agreement that became a regulation then later. So we're required to implement it. But we go a lot further. The Irish government has gone a lot further, and it has included things on gender identity, which I really are quite extraordinary in how vague they are. I'll just read the section here. Gender means the gender of a person, or the gender which a person expresses as the person's preferred gender, or which the person identifies and includes transgender, and a gender other than those of male and female. So that means there are 4 categories there at least. There's transgender, there's male, there's female, and then there's the gender that the person identifies with other than those genders. So, and within that category then, there could be a vast constellation of subgenders. We can only guess at what they will be. You'll soon discover when you...
Ina Dargy said there were 9. Our new MEP said there were 9. I think she has to revise her count, though.
Yeah. Well, one way of discovering it is to start tweeting and commenting and seeing how quickly the Gardaí call you, and then you'll find out what the protected genders are. I was going to say about the NGOs... I mean, I want to be fair here. The Irish Human Rights Commission has expressed concerns about some of the elements, technical elements, like reversing the burden of proof and so on. But I'm shocked at the paupacy of criticism from the NGO sector of this legislation. Remember, freedom of expression is a human right protected in international law, signed up to by this country, and protected in Bunreacht na Héireann. And the fact that they're not rallying around this human right strikes me as extraordinary.
It hurts me as someone that loves the sound of my own voice to say that the time is up. We have to finish.
And can I just say about the NGO sector in this country? They are bedfellows of the government. Make no mistake about it. However, the Irish people took the National Women's Council on there and the recent referendum, and the Irish people won. So well done to you all.
Well done, Sharon. That was worth hearing. Thank you very much, everybody.